Welcome to Network Capital, Anoop. It's so great to have you with us. You have been a mentor of mine for over a decade. I actually worked for you during my MBA internship. But one of the most rich aspects of having a mentor like you is that you've helped me think through some of the important career decisions. I remember thinking about my internship, thinking about the job to take when I met with an accident, how should I navigate that? So I'm blessed to have you back with us. Thank you again for your time.
Yeah, Utkarsh, thank you for inviting me to join you here on your platform. Just been following all of your incredible journey since the time we met, and it's just great to continue to be a part of each other's lives. I learn a tremendous amount from you as well.
I don't know if you remember, Anoop, but today is the exact day when you took me out for lunch when my internship was culminating 10 years back. So we discussed a variety of things, but one of them was how do we really think through careers? Is career a planned adventure or something that happens to you, or something in between? So could you just briefly tell us about your work life and your life at large, and how did you get here?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I think I feel like I'm hitting that midlife point where there's a lot of time for reflection, a lot of opportunity to look back at some of the decisions you made and why you made them. And I think a lot of it, a lot of the evolution. If I were to sum up the evolution from beginning to now, and I was thinking about this as I thought about our talk today, it comes down to this increased level of self-awareness. And as you get older and hopefully wiser, your wisdom is mostly informed by being more knowledgeable about yourself, about your preferences, your capabilities, what's important to you, your priorities and your values. And all of those things influence your decision making as you go forward. And what was a very narrow set of decision criteria early on in my career, pursuing maybe excellence and brand names and building a resume and looking at titles and compensation, has broadened a great deal, because now you think about family considerations. You think about what are you going to learn in the next opportunity. You think about who are the kinds of people you're going to work for. Does the organization match your values? And there's so many other considerations as you get to know yourself and you get to know what is important to you and what's going to make you, drive forward and have peak energy, throughout the week, throughout the year, and feel good about what you're doing every day. So I think that to me is the biggest theme about that drive. And, for me, as you know, my career has been a very unorthodox career, very similar to many people who will make different pivots and changes and turns. But there were some things that, were very consistent for me. On paper, it looks like a lot of zigs and zags, but in earnest, there was a lot of things that I really wanted to do in life as a young person. I knew I wanted to travel the world. I knew I wanted to be part of high-performing, excellent organizations. There was something that had to be happening there that I wanted to be a part of and wanted to learn from. I wanted to lead people. I wanted to be a leader. I wanted to be that person that people relied on to do the hard work and do the smart work and bring them forward and bring them along. And so all of those things influenced every one of those decisions. When you think about it, you had to have those itches kind of scratched as you considered new opportunities. And sometimes they were in the same industry and sometimes they weren't, and it required a change. But it always had, some learning attached to it and some other opportunity to build. So I look forward to telling you more here as we go along.
Yeah. So tell us about the Marine Corps. What does that mean? Why did you do it? And what did you learn?
Sure. My first, I guess, real job was as a United States Marine. And my motivation there really started from the fact that my parents were, immigrants from Delhi. to the United States, and the country, the United States, had given so much opportunity to my parents. I was born here and raised in the United States, and I felt a deep gratitude and sense of responsibility to give back, because our family had benefited so much from the opportunities. And many of you know the history of that. There was a huge wave of immigration, particularly from India and China and Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, that happened in 1965 and beyond, because of legislation that was passed after the Civil Rights Act here. So it was a pretty momentous time in the history of this country, in the history of the Indian diaspora in particular. And so for me, it was like, how do I contribute? How do I give back? And it was not a thought that a lot of, I would say, Indian families had. They were continuing to just pursue security and safety for their family, good careers, the kind of very tried and true paths that we all have come to know, right? But for me, it was important to end up serving. And I had a mentor, and I know mentorship is a common theme for many that have been on your show here, and it was true for me as well. I had a mentor at a very early stage who was a high school teacher of mine, who had served in the military, and I actually asked him about it, and he said, "Look, you're going to have the rest of your life to sit behind a desk, so you might as well go and have your opportunity to serve and have this adventure if it's something you really want to do and you feel deeply about." And that was it. It convinced me that I needed to serve, and of course there was only one branch to serve with, which was the best one, the Marine Corps. And so I only focused on the Marine Corps. I worked into the Navy ROTC program, which is kind of the feeder into the officer programs, and that allows you to go to college while doing some training, and then after you go to college, you serve for 4 years of active duty. And for me, that was a very transformational experience. I mean, I think many people who have served in the military talk about it as almost saving their, and literally talk about it as saving their life, because they were not particularly organized in their thinking. They were not particularly responsible for their actions, a little bit, kind of scattered in their interests. And, with the life of, kind of a military life and the values, it starts to really define who you are as a person, not only as a leader, but it also ties you to purpose. There's a tremendous amount of purpose in serving your country and serving particularly in a military unit, not only serving your country, but serving the person on your left and the person on your right, and making sure you're taking care of each other. And I think that those values really stayed with me throughout my career. I always found myself gravitating towards organizations and leaders who shared those values, who thought about leadership the same way, and found myself really turned off in organizations where those values didn't exist. And I saw both, and it really did help me define kind of what I started to look for as I pursued my career going forward.
Yeah. And 4 years for you in the Marine Corps. And then what did you decide to do, and what were the dilemmas that were presented once you finished your tenure there?
Yeah, I had actually considered staying in the Marines as a full career. I think anyone who comes in gives that amount of energy and time and receives that level of training, you think about it as a career path. And for me, a couple of things happened along the way. I met my wife Geeta in college, and we started kind of dating and when I was in the Marine Corps, and it became clear that life, with her career, and she's in the medical field, was not going to be compatible with a military career. So that was one influencer. So you start to see the influence of family considerations and personal considerations. And the other influencer was, I really thought about what else was I going to learn as I went forward, and what was I going to contribute, and was I optimizing my learning opportunity. And for me, my time in the Marine Corps was very rewarding. But the next job that I was going to be assigned to, and you don't have that much choice in the matter, was something that I felt in spending the next 4 years in, it was very similar to what I'd already been doing. And I didn't feel like there was a growth path there. And, I had a number of colleagues in the Marines who had gone off to get their MBAs. And it seemed like just a great way to accelerate learning, make a transition, and kind of continue to be a leader, but not necessarily in uniform, but in a broader context. And that's sort of how I decided to go apply for an MBA and ended up going to HBS.
And HBS was transformational in its own way. You must have met really incredible professors, peers who would make you think differently. What was the core learning for you during your MBA?
Yeah, I think for me, coming out of a military background, I was very, I understood. I had worked in different odd jobs in high school and before that were in the sort of business and retail, and I always had this sense of good business sense. But going to business school is a whole nother level of understanding that I didn't have. What I was very fearful of was that I was going to come in and I was going to be very unprepared. And what you find is when you go to any MBA program, and I recommend it for anybody who's considering some sort of transition or pivot in their career. But what I found was what I brought to the table was leadership experience and organizational development experience that others did not have. They had been individual contributors in their consulting firms or investment banking firms or other industrial or consumer firms, and they brought different skills and different perspectives and different insights to the classroom. But we could, we military veterans could bring a lot of other insights. And so immediately I realized there was something I could contribute. And the transformation that for me was that, I started to really understand the broader aspects of general management. I think the Harvard curriculum in particular is focused on general management, becoming that generalist who can lead organizations. And I started to really dig into each and every piece of that equation, and found a interest and a spike in commercial, like sales and marketing topics that I felt I was particularly well suited for, and really resonated with me. The lessons and the insights and the discussion, and so that gave me a clue as to some of the things that I might enjoy in the future. And that was really important. I think the other piece of that time was it allowed me to kind of move to the next phase, which was, I know you'll get to this and after HBS, but that summer I went to McKinsey, and I started at McKinsey after business school as well for a little over a year and a half or so. And I looked at all of that period of HBS and McKinsey as a chapter in my education. It was one was classroom education and one was practical education, and it gave me a lot of perspective. It put me in different difficult situations. It taught me the language of business. As I joke around, I used to in the Marines sometimes we use very colorful language, and I had to reduce that language quite a bit going into the boardroom at McKinsey. So it was my finishing school, if you will, coming out of the military and transitioning to kind of civilian life.
Yeah, so but let's look at your career so far. There's Stanford, there's Marine Corps, there's Harvard Business School, there's McKinsey. I mean, one would say that this is like an impressive CV which presents lots of options, and lots of options bring lots of confusion. So talk to us if you had any confusion.
Yeah.
How did you navigate it? And I know you had interest in serving. So was your interest in policy and politics nurtured around the same time?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I think my initial pursuit of what one might consider these institutions that have great reputations, great brands, and they have great reputations and great brands for a reason. They are truly grounded in excellence. And for me, pursuing excellence was a big part of my early years, that I really wanted to be, learn from the best, be among the best, and then hopefully by relationship, be the best and be among the best. And that to me was really important. I had an intrinsic desire to learn. And I felt that, again, whether it was Stanford, the Marine Corps, Harvard, or McKinsey, these were the places that really represented, kind of the best institutions and places I could learn from. And it was an incredible journey, obviously challenging to, be invited. And then obviously the challenge continues as you try to contribute. And it really makes you grow very rapidly. And so again, the lesson for me, and it was a lesson I kind of saw in a lot of, whether it was mentors or others in various readings, that there's a lot of advice that says go to really excellent places, whether they be large, unwieldy brand name type places, because you'll learn a lot. These are institutions that have done this work for a long time. And so you'll see the pattern of many great careers is starting at a place where they've been in one institution or two or maybe three that have been excellent in some way or the other. And that carries them forward and gives them a perspective that they can always draw on. Now, you asked about confusion. Yeah. It does create a lot of optionality, because you start to also work with people who are doing a great variety of things and just tremendous things. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this too, as you've been in equally excellent institutions, and you've seen your colleagues, they go pursue amazing careers, and you say, wow, that would be interesting. Let me try that, or I would love to do that. And this is where I go back to the point of self-awareness. You really do have to start to think about, what am I interested in? What am I good at? What do I love to do? What gives me energy? And as you keep asking yourself those questions and you keep learning in each place, I learned from the Marine Corps that leadership gives me energy. Leading people and taking care of my people gives me energy. I learned in McKinsey that being, actually I learned kind of the inverse lesson at McKinsey, that I didn't like to be a consultant. I actually did not enjoy consulting because I was sitting on the other side of the table from the leader. So, you're giving advice, but someone else is taking the decision. And that always felt hollow to me a little bit. But I appreciated what I learned there, because I learned how you make better decisions, how you use data to make decisions. And how you solve problems that are complex and break them down. And I think all of that helped me be a better leader going forward. But I kind of knew at that point consulting was not for me. So that those are the kinds of little lessons in self-awareness that you pick up along the way.
Yeah. Once I called you during my Microsoft tenure, I had to decide between two jobs. One was more focused on numbers and driving towards a sales outcome, and the other was more focused on strategy. And the advice that you given me drew upon your software experience, where building a business from scratch and being accountable for certain numbers was helpful to you. That's exactly what I did, and it transformed my life at Microsoft. Do you want to reflect of your software journey, of why you did those choices?
Yeah, no, thanks for the reminder, and I'm so glad that you made that decision, because similarly, I went a similar path after McKinsey. I realized, okay, here I was in this advisory role, and you really weren't accountable for much. Yes, you had to produce some analysis, and you had to. We used to joke at McKinsey, your currency or your deliverables were, producing a slide every day. But that just starts to feel empty, and it's the organization, doesn't necessarily hold you fully accountable for that level of quality or driving forward, right? It started to become about volume rather than anything else. And what I wanted to do is be in a role where I had some accountability, that my effort would lead directly to real results, right? And be able to feel that connection and see that connection, and not have it be so, I guess, obtuse or opaque, in terms of how that contribution really manifests itself. And so going in, what I ended up doing next after McKinsey was going to Siebel Systems, which was the leading CRM software company, and working in Washington, D.C. My wife's career was taking her to Washington, D.C. for training. So this is why we chose the DC area. And one of the best part about it was, I not only did I get to join a growing tech company, and I joined in a business development and sales position, but I also got to be in the DC area, and that played out for me in a number of ways down the road, which we'll get to. But for me, there was a lot of energy that I got from being around Washington, around government, around service, leveraging my background in the military, things that I knew how government agencies ran, and contributing that. And at Siebel, I was able to be in a position where I was accountable. I had a sales number. I had to achieve a certain amount of revenue through our partnerships and through our direct sales over that time. That made you incredibly focused, and it gave you that level, that feeling of accountability that you also have as a leader of people. You're always accountable for people, but this was an accountability for results. And so there's a difference, right? And that to me was a kind of a second level accountability that I hadn't had fully experienced in that level of intensity. And that was just a great opportunity. The other skills that I picked up in that chapter were really, working with outside parties. It became, you had to be in the market. You had to go and literally make relationships with people you'd never met before in companies that were very large and challenging to navigate. We were trying to partner with companies like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. These are big companies with lots of different competing interests. And you had to find your way in and find your way to not only make personal connections, but deliver business value. And all of that was just great training for really the way the world works. There's no company that doesn't partner or have suppliers or have dealers or distributors or investors, people you need to build relationships with, people you need to align with and drive initiatives together with. And that all comes from having those types of jobs that put you in the hot seat and force you to build those relationships. It's a little too late to do that, when you're later in your career and you've been tinkering on a something very internal, and then you have to build all these relationships. It becomes very challenging for people.
And then you decided to take another career transition, work in the government, then another transition. Talk to us of some of, you don't need to talk about every one of them, but some of the foundational ones that really changed the way your career was shaping up.
Yeah. Well, after that period in tech, I worked with two different companies doing very similar things with the government software and technology. And this is where the universe sort of here's your call. I continued to be very interested in service. And while I was in Washington, I again continued to network. And I think another theme, there's a theme of mentorship, but there's also a theme of constantly networking. I think networking, and you know this because you've called your platform Network Capital, but it is all about networking, right? Networking is such an important period. And at the end of this talk, I'll give you a couple of recommendations to the audience about some books that were really influential for me over the course of my career. One in particular was on networking. And, I was continuing to build relationships in DC, and this was President Bush had won his second term in office. And right at the cusp of that, there was Hurricane Katrina, and some of the older members of the audience will remember Hurricane Katrina was a devastating hurricane that hit particularly Louisiana, but most of the Gulf Coast of the United States. It required a lot of response and organized response from the government due to the scale of the devastation. The federal government was very involved in kind of the repair and resolution of people's lives, businesses, relocating, finding new housing, rebuilding housing. So there was a number of missions that were really reliant on a well-functioning federal government. And at that point, it became clear that the Bush administration needed new talent in the government at that time to address some of these issues. And a lot of the agencies were ill-equipped to respond to something of this scale. So they brought in some senior leaders, in particular, a gentleman who became a lifelong mentor of mine. Steve Preston became the head of the SBA, Small Business Administration, and he came from a private sector background, and he was seeking other private sector, kind of young, energetic leaders to come in and help him fix things, right? And fix the processes and operations. And I got a call, and what was fortuitous about it was I'd been kind of itching to get back into service at some point. You're in Washington long enough, you kind of get that bug. And I was already in Washington. I didn't have to make a massive sacrifice on the family front because I already lived there. I literally was working only 2 metro stops away. At that point in my career, compensation wasn't that big a factor, right? I wasn't getting a huge pay cut. So for me, it was just a great fortuitous opportunity to go in and work for a very principled, values-driven, no nonsense leader, kind of avoid the politics of the day because we were trying to fix things. And any crisis, the politics get pushed aside and people just want results. And that was a great environment to be in. The government gets some bad press for being very bureaucratic and very slow. But when you have a crisis to solve, there's nothing that can move faster with more scale and more impact than government agencies because of the resources that they have. So there was a great opportunity to do that. I did that for 2 years, both at SBA and then at the Housing and Urban Development in the middle of the housing crisis. Another, massive trial by fire opportunity. I was deputy chief of staff of that agency, huge agency, huge impact on American families all across housing and mortgage, lending, and as well as disaster recovery, and learned a lot in that 2-year period. And it was really interesting because if I look back at my career, there are certain points in your career where you can say the learning was deep. I mean, the learning was transformational. And it need not be a 10-year tenure or a 5-year tenure. You can learn a lot inside of 2 years at any institution or organization if it's intense enough and if the work is challenging enough and complex enough. And I think I took so much learning from that 2-year period. I learned more in those 2 years than I did the previous 4.5 in tech. And I think that to me was, again, another transformational opportunity to flex your muscles, build some skills, build some confidence, and hopefully take that forward into the next journey.
Do you want to give us some advice on how do you learn and how did you network at the times when you were able to network most effectively?
Yeah. Networking for me is such it's a constant. It should, if anyone wants to have a dynamic career, networking should be like breathing. It is continuous. In the Marine Corps, we used to say sleep is continuous because you always wanted to find opportunities to rest when you're, in combat, right, or in the field, training for combat. But same thing I say in business, networking is continuous, and networking has to be continuous because you never fully appreciate the power of your network until one day you're seeking help, or you are needing a reference, or you are looking for other opportunities, and not necessarily career opportunities, but even opportunities to learn about something on a personal level, or do something in nonprofit. So having a dynamic network and constantly networking is important. And what I would do, my technique, and it's become a lot easier. Those were the days before LinkedIn and some of the social media tools we have today. But in those days, it was all about finding those times to reach out and have breakfast with people. If you run into someone or have a call with someone, follow up and have a deeper conversation if you weren't satisfied with that first connection. Looking at people who are different than you and going and having lunch with them, or going to different events that you knew were going to bring a lot of like-minded people together, whether they're alumni networking events or young professional events or whatever it could be. So I was very active in trying to get out and meet as many people as I could and build as many relationships, not selfishly as much as I enjoyed meeting new people and learning from them. But in the end, it does help you because you will find you learn best. And this gets to your learning question. How do you learn? I learn best from other people. I learn best from those conversations. And so there's a nice synergy between learning and networking for me. I can pick up a book, I can digest the framework, but until I've met people who've applied the framework, or I can see it in real life, I have a hard time having it resonate deeply and kind of stick with me, because I need to see the practical example. I want to see that living example and breathing example of how that has manifested itself in someone else's career or someone else's life journey. And I think that is really important, to learn from others' experiences.
What made you take up the Harley-Davidson assignment? I mean, that's where I worked for you, but what was the
Yeah.
driving?
Well, after the government stint, I had the opportunity to make a change, right? And it was a forced change because, in the US, when the new president comes in, all of the appointees of the prior president leave their post. And so I knew this change was coming. Again, you'll see a theme here that integrates family considerations, but my wife, who's also Indian American and was in the medical career, she had received a research grant to continue some research she had started that was happening in rural part of Maharashtra. So for her to continue that research, we would have to move to India effectively, because we had two young daughters at that point, and we couldn't really manage this back and forth thing with the family structure we had at the time. And we knew it would be great for our family, for them to be there, for us to be closer. And so the way to solve this puzzle was I had to find a meaningful role in India. And that was the problem I had to solve. So this was an interesting transition, because I had kind of ceded control of my career at some point to this much larger family consideration, right? And it was a very personal consideration too, being of Indian origin. I had been a tourist in India, visiting family and coming back to the US, but I had never lived there. I didn't feel so connected on a personal level. I felt connected culturally and values and all of that, but I didn't feel connected to the country itself, right? The city, the ability to operate there. I didn't always feel comfortable. Would I ever feel comfortable on my own there was always something on the back of my mind. And having this opportunity to bring our family, establish our home, learn how to work there, live there, build the friendships there, was so meaningful on a personal level, that personal consideration and the family consideration of my wife's work took over and forced this transition. So big change for me to subordinate myself to all of that and start to think differently. And so the focus search was, how do I find an opportunity? And this is where luck helps along the way. There's a lot of luck involved, but this is also where networking matters. And I go back to networking because my opportunity with Harley, the origin of that was through a classmate of mine at business school, who I developed a deep friendship with. And he was leading one of the major factories at Harley in the United States. And we were talking, and I said, look, I'm looking for opportunities in India. And I had no expectation he would be able to even be helpful in that area, because I was just really catching up with him on a personal level. And he said, look, I think Harley is trying to break into the Indian market and do it direct instead of through a distributor. And I said, really, that's interesting. And he put me in touch with the head of Asia Pacific. One thing led to another, and I received the opportunity, and it was such a great culmination. This opportunity, not only was it great for my family, but this opportunity was transformational for me in a different way, which was it allowed me to take all the individual skills and tools that I had built up over my previous career, the strategy work at McKinsey, the kind of leadership and adaptability in the Marines, the sales and alliance building and partnership building. I learned in tech, the work with the government and the public sector, and selling into the public sector, being in the government and having to then use those skills and knowledge to then influence government. All of those came together in the Harley-Davidson India opportunity, which was effectively to start that business from square one in India. And that turned into, because it was so transformational and it tapped into all of my skills, it felt so natural. It was such a challenging opportunity on paper. I mean, starting, selling Harleys in India at that point. Today, maybe we wouldn't think it was a very, very big deal. But back in 2009, this was before Starbucks was in India. This was before, there were a lot of things that hadn't happened yet in India. And we all had the view of the roads and the infrastructure, and no one could even imagine how we would do this. And so it just became one of those high risk, high reward, but very personally aligned opportunities. And that's why I enjoyed it so much. And I think that's why we had so much success.
Yeah, but it wasn't easy. Do you want to talk to us about some of the more challenging experiences of setting up the business in India? And what did that
Yeah.
experience teach you?
Yeah, I think for me, certainly on a personal level, I was learning a lot. It was like rapid fire learning. I was learning a new company, learning a new brand, learning a new market, and almost establishing a new segment of that market with the, kind of more premium motorcycling in India, which hadn't really been defined or explored in full. I was also learning some new skills. There were some things I hadn't done prior to coming to Harley, like working with the media. I did a lot of media because this was such a big deal. And not only when we launched and announced, but then on an ongoing basis, as we grew and as we worked with the business media and the enthusiast media and all of that, that was a whole new skill I had to develop. And so, there was so much learning going on. And I think, I had to have a very open mindset. I had to come in very humble and wanting to learn and very open, not saying that I knew how to do this and that. I had a plan, though. You had a vision. You knew where you wanted to go. We had a very clear kind of roadmap as to what we wanted to accomplish by when. And the art of it was, how are you going to get there? And that's where the fun was. It was all about, how do you solve this problem and that problem? And part of the biggest challenge was really being a cultural bridge. We had a company, Milwaukee, Wisconsin based global company, but effectively the company was more of an exporter at that stage. They had done a lot more to just export things that they made in the US and then send them to a distributor to handle the local market. And this was the first market we were starting as a subsidiary, where we were learning the market as a company, not leaving it to the distributor to teach us over time what that market was about. And I think that was the biggest thing, was educating in both directions, right? Educating the Indian market and all the new employees about what was Harley-Davidson about, and vice versa, educating everyone in Wisconsin and other supporting areas what India was about and what it meant to be in this market and how we had to approach the market. And I remember one really fortuitous hire that I made. There was a wonderful woman who became our colleague, who was based in Gurgaon, because her husband was an expat for a construction company, an infrastructure company. And she heard that we were coming into India, and she said, "Hey, I would love to help." And, I met her for coffee, and I was scratching my head, kind of thinking, how is she going to help? Because she didn't have a background in automotive or the industry, but she was from Wisconsin.
Okay.
And and I knew, and she was super, super talented in many, many ways, despite, no automotive experience. But I think the luck there was, we brought her on to help be part of that cultural bridge. She could help me be an extension of my voice and helping connect and actually do it even better than me, because she grew up in Wisconsin. She related very closely to the people we were working with on a daily basis. They felt very comfortable calling her and talking to her and asking her questions that they may not otherwise feel comfortable talking to a new Indian colleague who was still learning the company, and vice versa. So there was a lot of cultural bridging that had to happen. And I think that, to me, took up a lot of energy, but it was also well worth it, because it really did establish the brand in a very authentic way.
So I remember you launched many initiatives, Bikes for Women, looking at setting up different cities, a customer relationship management program, building a community. All of this is happening. India is changing alongside. Uh, Tell us about your role as a father, because you also had to change schools, change cities,
Mm.
change everything for your children. What was that for them, and what did that experience teach you as a dad?
Yeah, great question. I was first blessed with my life partner, right, which is a big part of anyone's path, right, is who you have as your life partner. And my wife Geeta was just incredibly talented and also so conscientious about establishing our home in India. She really felt much more connected to India her whole life. For her, this was a much deeper connection. I was just starting my connection, I think, at that point. And we felt very strongly that our kids should also feel that same connection, that we shouldn't wait till they're in their 30s to give them this opportunity. But here we are. How are they going to get that opportunity? And one of the choices or decisions we had to make was about schooling. How do you think about schooling? Here we were, American expats by definition, though we're of Indian origin, is we could easily have sent our kids to a American school. The American school is right there in Delhi, and it would have been the natural choice, as it is for many Americans who are there. But we actually thought it would be a disservice to our kids. We wanted them to feel. It's not about what they necessarily remember. A lot of people talk about how our kids were very young. They were both under 5. So, they made, at that moment, they weren't going to remember a lot. And luckily we stayed long enough for our older one to be fluent in Hindi. And the younger one, I think, now feels a very strong connection because we stayed for 6 years. But, the pivotal decision was sending them to a local Indian school that was near our home. And it was challenging. It was intimidating. It was challenging for us as parents because we did not fit the typical profile of the parents there. In fact, it's a funny story. I said I've never had tougher interviews than interviewing for a private school in Gurgaon, because we had to go through 3 rounds with these guys, because it was they were really struggling to understand why Americans would want to send their kids to this school. And it was such a beautiful school and beautifully run with a lot of great values. And we just felt like it was the best place. And it has been very formative. And our friendships that we made there with parents from that school have been lifelong. We continue to stay in touch with them. Our kids stay in touch with their classmates still, even though we've moved a couple countries since then. And it was just so formative. And I think that to me was a big part of being a father, was giving them those opportunities to understand who they are and where they come from, and make that part of who they are, rather than kind of a footnote or a box to check on a form. But they actually feel truly that they are Indian, and they have that connection to both India and America.
I mean, congratulations, because I have heard that this is one of the hardest things to get right, the transition, the cultural transition, feeling of belonging for multinational couples and families, so to speak. Anoop, tell me, when does one know that it's time to end things, to start a new tour of duty? Reid Hoffman talks about like looking at careers as different tours of duty, which I think is a military concept. Do you want to talk
Mm-hmm.
to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I question, and I think this idea of chapters. I talked a little bit earlier in the conversation about a chapter concept, and I looked at my HBS McKinsey time as one chapter, and then my time in tech sales, and it was one chapter. My government service was a chapter, and then Harley became a series of kind of a 3-act play. I was in India for 6 years. I ended up then being asked to lead our transition from a distributor to a subsidiary in Canada, which was our second biggest market in the world, and led that market for 2.5 years in Toronto. And then I moved to the U.S. market and joined in Milwaukee, which is, all roads lead to headquarters eventually in big companies. And when I got to Milwaukee, I was on my seventh year with Harley-Davidson, and I was excited to be there. It was a great, to be in the kind of the crown jewel of the business. Really working with a large number of dealers. I was responsible for 700 dealers around the country in terms of all of our product and dealer initiatives. And it was a big job, and I really enjoyed it. But what changed for me in that third act was, I look back and why I joined in the first place. I was bringing my full self to the job. I was leveraging every skill that I had developed. It was challenging me and stretching me. When I went to Canada, I had a similar experience. I was learning a new market, had to learn new things. The new skill was taking an ongoing concern of our distributor and transitioning it to a subsidiary without affecting operations, and also growing the market share at the same time. So lots of really, rich challenges in both of those roles. When I got to the US, and I think you see this in a lot of the large companies, you are now part of a much bigger infrastructure. And so your job tends to be very narrow. You have a narrow scope. So you are now working with someone on your left and your right who have maybe the scope that you used to have as a country manager. You now share that level of scope with 5 different people. You have one aspect of it, and then you have to collaborate and coordinate with others. And, Harley was going through a lot of challenges in the US market, a lot of change at the leadership level. A lot of my mentors had left. And I wasn't able to bring all of my full self to that job because I wasn't necessarily the general manager of the whole business. And I realized at that point that I was cutting myself short. I was selling myself short by being a specialist in one aspect and not continuing to build on that general management line of thinking. And I also didn't have mentors who I'd previously worked with and valued. They were no longer with the organization. They were still my mentors outside the organization, but no longer in the organization. So I was starting to feel disconnected, a little bit disengaged, because it didn't feel as challenging and as dynamic. And it would have been easy for me to just kind of say, okay, hey, I'm just going to ride it out in this job. I'll be sort of what's the current of quietly quitting or whatever it might be. You're sort of sitting back.
Quiet quitting.
Right. But for me, that's not possible. I'm just too wired for movement, dynamism. You can bring. I want to bring direction and velocity to everything I do, and that was not going to happen in that particular time. And so I was about to hit the 10-year mark, and I decided that was it. I was no longer getting the satisfaction. 10 years felt like a good number. It goes well in your follow-on conversations where you say you spent 10 years somewhere. And I learned a ton from that company. I still have my Harley in the garage, and I ride it every weekend. So I gained a lot of both personally, professionally, and just emotionally. Some of my best friends today are still people I worked with during that time, and that's what it was. And you just sometimes have to pack it in and say, it's no longer giving me as much as I'm giving it. And there's an equation there. This was an important reframe that I got from a mentor, and it's really challenging, especially if you've worked somewhere that long, and particularly if you work for a brand that forms your identity. Your identity becomes part of the company, right? And I think you've written about this in your article about how you felt very identified with Microsoft, and I felt the same way with Harley. But there's a point where you have to reframe that, because if you're giving more than the company's giving you, the equation is wrong, and you have to look at your workday. Take it down to the workday. Every day you give 8 hours or 10 hours, whatever it may be, and you work hard and you give all you got, and the company compensates you for that, and hopefully they give you something else. But at the end of that workday, you're even. and no one has any loyalty to each other beyond that day until you come back the next day and you both decide you want to do it again the next day. And I think there's something in that, because I think a lot of people hang on to jobs too long. They stay in those jobs out of kind of some sense of loyalty to people they worked with, or the firm, or some sense of like, well, they really helped me in that difficult time 2 years ago. I'm going to stay on even though it's a dead end job. And I think I would challenge that. I would just say, think about that a little bit more critically. And you are not your job. Your job is not you. It is not your identity. You're a constantly moving, learning, growing person, and person who has a family maybe and other responsibilities. And you have to think more holistically about that.
Oh, this is such a thoughtful mental framework for people to look at. Thank you for sharing this, Anoop. I would imagine that now you could have retired if you wanted to. I mean, very early. You have achieved, I would imagine, a certain amount of financial success, CV success, meaning you had a rich life, family settled, but you decided for more adventures. And when you decide to undertake more adventures, the path becomes, in a way, easy, but in a way more difficult as well, because the benchmark is higher. You
Yeah.
expect greater compensation, you expect more out of work life, out of life in general. Talk to us about this phase after quitting Harley. And it doesn't need to be a set of answers. Questions are absolutely okay.
Yeah, sure. This was a very introspective phase, because you do come to a point where you've had a lot of wins. You've achieved a lot. We were now here in Milwaukee. Your kids are now in higher grades in school. Moving has more consequences in terms of relocating. So you start to balance all of these factors in, and it was interesting. I was a little lost, honestly, after I was leaving Harley. I was still now trying to figure out what is the next move. And when you're in that mid-career cycle, you can start to kind of shift and say, okay, what are you going to lean into? Are you going to lean into a trajectory that you had been building your whole career? For me, which was general management, and this kind of idea of a path towards more responsibility and more leadership of an organization? Or are you going to take what you learned and apply it in a different way, and not necessarily pursue that trajectory? For some people, that means going into sitting on boards and retiring and mentoring others, or being a consultant, or working in a PE firm as an operating partner, or being a teacher, making a full transition to teaching, and going to a university and giving lectures and courses. It could mean all of those things. I wasn't quite ready for that. And, one thing I did do, though, and I knew I needed more perspective. And I got again, through networking, some friends of mine who I'd known from HBS again. They knew I was going through this transition, and they called me and said, why don't you try joining our firm, Egon Zehnder, which is an executive search firm, one of the top firms globally, and come join our automotive and mobility practice. You have this experience now. You've worked in multiple countries. You have a lot of credibility with both clients and candidates. Why don't you come and learn this and see if this works for you? And there was kind of the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. And the devil was whispering in my ear saying, you hated consulting, don't do consulting, because executive search is really another form of consulting. And then the angel was saying, this is a great opportunity. This is a very reputable firm. Remember, you love excellence, be around excellent people, go see what they do. And I was a bit torn, and I decided I would take the plunge and I would check it out, because I did love the people. The people are just extraordinarily, just beautiful people. I mean, and I say that it's hard to come up with a word, because just the human values that drives that firm, the professional experience that people have there, the consideration they have for each other, for their clients. It's unlike anything I've seen anywhere I've been, and I've been exposed to a lot. And so I just felt so compelled to join and learn and try to absorb those values. And I did really consider it as a potential career path change. And I worked at it for just under a year. And it was going well. And I was actually considering even a family move to accommodate it. And something landed in my lap, which was a call from, again, another former colleague who I knew and had worked with, who said, "Hey, I'm going to become chief operating officer of this company, and I want you to come and interview for a president role." And that was out of left field. It wasn't necessarily something I was looking for actively. But then, the devil on the shoulder said, "Hey, remember, this was your general management trajectory. This is you don't like consulting. You're never going to like it. At one point, you'll get frustrated. Come take a hard look at this." And I forced myself to go and look, and it was one of those things that, had it been a lesser role, I might have walked away from it and said, "Yeah, this is not worth the change again." But it was a meaningful change in my trajectory in terms of responsibility. And the biggest part of it was I'd really been a country leader, a commercial leader in my time at Harley. I ran commercial markets. I didn't necessarily own all of the manufacturing and the product development side of the equation, because Harley was a very kind of a bifurcated company that way. The P&L owner at Harley was the CEO. There was no P&L owners at mid levels. And I really wanted that opportunity to run the whole business, right? From every single cost input to every output. That you are the P&L or profit and loss leader. The buck stops with you. You're accountable to the board. You're accountable to investors. Back to that level of accountability that I really enjoyed in tech. And that was what they were positioning for me, was a role that I would have the whole responsibility, the commercial side, the operations side, the manufacturing side. And that to me was worth the change, because it was another level of learning that I had not experienced. And if you can continue to learn in your mid-career and in your later early career, I think that to me is what keeps the excitement and the dynamism going. The networking is continuous, but the learning also has to be continuous for it to be enjoyable and meaningful. I think there is a point where you pivot to teaching, not learning. And I think that comes maybe, it's different for everybody, but for me, I think that'll be in my 60s. So I've still got about 10 years plus to go to learn more and to continue to learn and grow. And that's kind of how I made that decision.
This is fascinating. I once wrote an article for Harvard Business Review on career transitions, and I feel that now I should write another one following up based on our conversations. Because it's so difficult to plan. It's a combination of luck, serendipity, network, skills, and what you want to do with your lives. And there isn't a formula, but there are things that one can pick up. I asked these questions to Indra Nooyi, to members of parliament, and for all of them, there are commonalities between what you said, what people in different sectors and leaders are saying. So it's fascinating. I know we've had a long discussion, just a couple of more, and then I'll let you carry on with your day. Just looking back, you zoom out your career. Give us some high-level takeaways about what not to do. You've had a rich career, but you also would have seen mistakes, young professionals making, people who report to you, board members, other things. What are spaces that people should avoid?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that is really important, and I touched on this at the beginning of the talk, was constantly seeking self-awareness, and how you do that is there's multiple ways, right? But the easiest way is to constantly be seeking genuine, authentic feedback. Having people who will tell you the truth, whether they're your peers, your subordinates, if you have people reporting to you, giving that trust and that space so that you can get genuine feedback. Your mentors will give you good feedback, of course, as well. And I think that to me has to be constant. I've seen people later in their career, they've never really had real feedback. And when they reach mid-level career, the first time they get feedback that's particularly constructive and in many ways points out their weaknesses and their development areas, it's shocking for them. They don't accept it because they've always been given kind of this faint praise or false praise. And people were always sort of stroking them with their egos, but not giving them kind of a true, like, hey, this is not something you do well. You're not a good team player, or you are very abrasive when you're challenged, or you're very controlling. These are things that derail people as they move through their career. And if you're not aware of those things early and you make those corrective steps or really reflect on them and try to adjust your style, it becomes much harder as you go. And that's really what differentiates people once you get past mid-level and into these senior roles. It's really not an age thing. It's a maturity thing. It's a skill thing. People like to point to age and say, well, they've been around. Well, it doesn't matter. If they're not self-aware, they're going to fail. And if they're very self-aware at a young age, they'll be very successful. That's one. Yeah. I'll give you one more that I think is really important. And you may have encountered this framework before, and I think it's a lovely framework that I've revisited, and I've even taught to my kids is the Ikigai framework, and I'm sure you must be familiar with it. But that framework, I would encourage anyone to look at their own career and their path. I think it's very, very insightful, because when you feel things are drifting, like I shared in the Harley example, you can go back to that framework and you will feel it if you answer the questions honestly in that framework. Which it's just very important to revisit that every 6 months to say, are you being fulfilled? Are you achieving your purpose at this moment? It might have been your purpose 2 years ago. Is it still your purpose based on all the factors that come into play? I think that's really important. And there's a very similar framework that I've really loved recently, a book by a woman named Christina Wallace. She's a professor at HBS, called The Portfolio Life. It's very new, but you may be familiar, and it really forces you to think about what are the things that drive you. You will very rarely get all of your personal satisfaction from your job. There are other things that may give you satisfaction. For me, it's public service, it's my leadership, ability to lead, and it's having that general management responsibility. These are my Venn diagram has this, those three have to be fulfilled, and I fulfill my service now through nonprofit service and advocating for issues I believe in, and that keeps me connected to kind of public service. That's not my day job. I don't get paid for it, but it still gives me that deep satisfaction. I encourage everyone to never suppress those things that give you energy and satisfaction. Find ways to incorporate them in your life.
Thank you so much, Anoop. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any parting words of advice that you'd like to share, book recommendation, anything that has helped?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple of quick book recommendations. I talked about networking. There are two books. One is a very old classic by a guy named Harvey McKay, and it's called Dig Your Well Before You're Thirsty. And it's a very old school networking book, but it's still very true today. And then a more modern book was written by a classmate of mine, Keith Ferrazzi, called Never Eat Lunch Alone, and another great networking book. And I think that's an incredible book to read. I mentioned Portfolio Life. I think that's a great book. And another book that's really influenced me early, it's also a classic, was written by the former head of, I think, Heidrick and Struggles, Rich Citrine, and it's called 5 Paths of Extraordinary Careers. And he basically looks at this idea of having multiple chapters in your life and looks at people who have done different things. And when he wrote this book, it was quite revolutionary, because people have really still had the paradigm of, I work at the same company for 30 years and I retire. And he followed folks who had really made these different zigs and zags And I think that that's becoming much more, the norm as we go forward, as you see in, Christina Wallace's book. So those are some book ideas. I think it's, again, self-awareness. If you know the itches you want to scratch in life, make sure that everything you pursue is scratching those itches, and what those things are, the things that you dreamed about when you were 10 years old, lying in bed, traveling the world, or being in a leadership role, or being a professional, whatever it might be. Those are the things that are going to give you raw energy to drive forward. And, I wish everyone well in their journey.
Nope, this particular podcast will go out to 250,000 people, and I'm pretty sure each one of them would be inspired by, the rich life and career that you've led. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and for being so candid and reflective about your career. It, of course, has transformed my life in myriad ways, but now hopefully I'm able to take these lessons more broadly.
Well, thank you, Utkarsh, for including me in your journey and your platform. It's just tremendous what you've achieved and the reach that you have and the service you're doing for others. So congratulations, and look forward to staying connected.